You're not half the woman your sister is. Those words hit like a physical shove. I remember the exact weight of the fork in my hand, the way the silver bent light across my knuckles as if the world itself had tilted and spilled everything I'd ever tried to build. The room went quiet the way an audience holds its breath before a performance turns ugly. Hannah's smile faltered. My dad didn't bother to blink. My mom looked at me like she'd just finished reading a verdict she'd been waiting to hand down for years. Family dinners were supposed to be safe, soft lighting, food that smells like home, voices that reassure. In our house they were more like quarterly reviews conducted by a panel that loved Hannah and tolerated me. I had learned, the hard way, how to sit small and take up less space so none of their comparisons could find purchase. That night everything I had compressed into politeness and good manners cracked open, and I remembered how loud humiliation sounds when you're supposed to be family. My name is, I'm telling this as if I were sitting across from you, because that's how I live through it now, narrating the thing that broke me so it loses some of its power. My sister, Hannah, is the one who never had to explain herself. Perfect grades. Perfect fiancé. A career that looks like a billboard. She's been handed admiration like confetti. Me? I learned early on how to fold my own celebration into tidy paper cranes and tuck them away where nobody would notice. That evening started ordinary. Hannah had just announced her engagement like someone reading the weather, excited, practiced, warmly precise. Her fiancé sat next to her, the kind of man who smiles like a postcard and knows the right thing to say to every aunt. Conversation orbited them, wedding dates, venues, honeymoon destinations that sounded expensive and enormous. I clapped. I asked questions. I meant it all. Then my mother angled a look at me over the steam of her mashed potatoes and asked, with that tone reserved for unpaid bills and school report cards, "Are you seeing anyone?" I said no. She sighed. The sigh turned into a lecture about women needing to settle down. My father added a comment about bringing someone by the holidays. I laughed it off. The room leaned in like on cue, waiting for some dramatic stumble I would inevitably provide, and then, because my parents had been stockpiling little cuttings of criticism for decades and were finally ready to apply one, my mom put down her fork and said what she always implied. "You're not half the woman your sister is." The words were both specific and thoroughly comprehensive. They were a review of my looks, my choices, my worth. The sentence sat on the table like a centerpiece and everything else seemed unimportant. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of the legs on the floor sounded huge. My hands were shaking. I didn't plan what I said next. "I can't do this anymore," slipped out of me like a confession and a threat at once. Nobody reached for me. Nobody called me back. If you're still here, if this type of story is the reason you clicked, please know it takes time and heart to share. If you'd like to support more honest stories like this, please consider subscribing. It means the world. I promise to keep telling the messy, true ones. Growing up in my house felt like learning an elaborate script where you were only allowed to play second lead. Not because we weren't fed or loved, but because love in our family came with footnotes. It was, "We love you, but..." And then the buts arrived heavy and many. Hannah could do no wrong. Everything she touched became a story worth repeating to visitors. When she played piano at a family reunion, my mother's eyes turned into applause. When I brought a drawing, a sketch of my grandma with curly hair and the sun behind her, the praise was polite but thin. "Maybe one day you'll find something you're good at too," my mom said, as if encouragement came with an expiration date. School magnified those dynamics. At 15, Hannah became valedictorian and pocketed praise like it was scarce oxygen. I worked, studied, joined clubs, and poured myself into communications because stories fascinated me, how a well-placed sentence could shift someone's whole day. When I graduated with my communications degree, the same hands that clapped for her graduation barely made a sound. "So what will you do with that?" my mother asked, like a discount coupon had been handed to someone who expected a prize. I learned to calibrate my joy to the room. When I published an article that got more traction than I dared hope, my dad said, "Well, it's not like you're running the company," in the same voice he used for mildly disappointing weather. When I spearheaded a small volunteer initiative at a community center, teaching kids how to craft good stories and speak up, my mother smiled and murmured, "That's nice, but don't overextend yourself." It was as if anything I did could be praised only while simultaneously being diminished, an act of conditional kindness that taught me to expect the latter. But there were moments, secret, stubborn ones, where I believed my life actually counted. I had friends who called me brilliant at 2 a.m., who read my work and said it moved them. I wasn't failing. I had a job I loved enough to stay late for sometimes. I had an apartment that smelled like bread on Sundays and a neighbor who baked 2 and left me figs when she had too many. Outside my parents' house, I collected small proofs that I mattered. Back at home, the comparison was relentless. Holidays became competitions in my head when they were supposed to be peaceful. At family barbecues, relatives asked Hannah about internships and awards and future plans while directing a single, politely puzzled question at me, "What does she do?" And then pivoting away, as if my explanation were an interruption. The message was clear: success had a template and I didn't fit it. When Hannah landed a job in finance straight out of her Ivy League degree, the congratulations were loud and frequent. My parents treated her milestones like shared victories, though she had achieved them on her own. An engagement announcement only amplified the ritual. The house filled with flowers and warm adjectives. My parents had built a narrative around her. She was the one they had raised right, punch ticket to the life they admired, and could now brag about at church. I had become background detail in their success story. That night, seated across from the gleam of Hannah's engagement ring, the pattern felt obvious and cruel, as if the entire timeline of my life had been waiting for someone to utter the formal sentence that would justify their favoritism. My mom's words weren't an accident. They were a distillation of years of tiny dismissals. I felt like an actor in a play where the script had decided I was only allowed peripheral lines. When I pushed my chair back, I didn't just step away from dinner. I stepped away from an identity that had been enforced with the steady drip of comparison. I left because staying meant continuing to accept the narrative that I was, by measure, less. Walking home in the cold that night, the city lights blurring in the rain, I replayed the last decade into a roll of film, my attempts to impress at science fairs, the dozen volunteer events, the nights I'd stayed up editing a friend's speech instead of going out. Each memory had been quietly minimized, reduced to not as much as Hannah. And suddenly, the idea of performing for an audience that had already made up its mind felt unbearable. I sat on my couch and let the silence grow. For the first time in a long time, I didn't try to fix myself according to someone else's blueprint. The relief was immediate and frightening. If they'd always seen me as second best, maybe it wasn't because I lacked something, but because they'd decided I did, and then stacked evidence around their decision. The days that followed the dinner were both reckless and meditative. I called in sick more than usual just to avoid the expected phone calls. I took long walks and let my mind wander to possibilities, some small, redecorating my living room, teaching an extra workshop, and some enormous, quitting my job and backpacking across a country I'd only read about. I wasn't impulsive in the cliché sense. It was more like I was recalibrating, measuring my life by my own compass for the first time in a while. A neighbor named Rosa asked me to sit in on a local storytelling night she hosted. I hesitated. Public speaking felt exposed in a way that family critique didn't, but I went. That stage was different. The people there had no history with me, no secret ledger of my supposed inadequacies. They listened. I told a smaller version of this story, about being the sibling in the shadow, and people who didn't know my family nodded, some with tears. I realized, sitting under those warm lights, that my voice mattered outside my parents' living room. The validation was soft and human, and it didn't come with a side of backhanded commentary. Still, leaving was complicated. Practical ties existed, a job I'd trained for, bills, obligations. Emotional anchors existed too, the memory of a dad who could be kind when he wanted to, a mother with a laugh that could make any room lighter, and a sister who, in private moments, was gentle and not the cardboard trophy I'd sometimes envision. Walking away was not a clean cut. It was a messy rearrangement of pieces that had been glued together by family expectations. One morning, 2 weeks after the dinner, Hannah texted me. It was simple: "I'm sorry about what Mom said. I love you." There was an apology for the family dynamic, but not much else. I read those 3 words and felt both soothed and furious. Hannah had always been raised on a different track. She'd been offered praise like a free pass, mercies were easy for her. But she had also been raised to love me, and I wanted to believe that. There's a particular kind of guilt that comes from wanting your sister to succeed even when that success has been served to you as an indictment. I wanted to be happy for Hannah, to dance at her wedding and celebrate her success, but I also wanted to be seen. Those wants felt incompatible in a house that had trained people to measure us like things on a shelf. So I started small. I set a boundary: fewer dinners where I would be measured. I told friends I couldn't attend family gatherings that week. I needed time. Secretly, I also applied for a fellowship I'd always thought was beyond me, one that required essays and interviews and a kind of confidence I'd been told I didn't have. When I hit submit, my palms sweated and I laughed because it felt like the smallest rebellion and the largest act of faith all at once. What would you do in this situation? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious how others would handle it. And then, because life loves irony, my parents called. They were calm, measured, and a little shocked that I'd actually left. My mother wanted to know if I'd eaten. My father asked if I was coming back for Thanksgiving. But there was no admission of intent. No, we were wrong. They asked for normalcy, and I realized that asking for change in the middle of a performance where you're always judged is an act they hadn't budgeted for. A month after I walked out, the invitation arrived, a formal, embossed card asking me to be present for an engagement dinner, one of those family rituals that meant everything had to look polished. The timing felt cruel, as if the world had planned to test whether my "I can't do this anymore" was permanent. I had choices. I could avoid the theater entirely, quietly excluding myself. Or I could show up and set a boundary that wasn't just about absence but about courage. I chose to go. This decision wasn't born from a hope they'd apologize, it came from something more necessary. I needed to see if I could stand in the same room and be myself. I needed to test whether I could refuse to fold into the shape they'd drawn for me. The preparation felt almost militant. I practiced phrases in the mirror that were not excuses and not attacks, simple truths: "I'm happy for you," and "I'm making different choices," and "I won't accept comparisons." I rehearsed how my voice should sound: steady, not pleading, clear without venom. I bought a jacket that made me feel like the woman I wanted to be, composed, present, and a little fierce. On the drive to their house, my hands gripped the steering wheel with a kind of reverence. I played no music. I let my thoughts gather into a bundle I could carry into the room. The house smelled like lemon polish and roast beef. Inside, guests smiled and offered perfunctory hugs. Hannah hugged me the way she always did, warm but practiced. Her fiancé greeted me like I was someone he already liked. The table was set with the same precision as always. When my mother's eyes met mine across the china and crystal, there was a moment where I felt the old pattern bristle, her ready critique ready to land. But I was prepared. I had rehearsed my calm. I had rehearsed my self-worth. I had, in small private ways, begun to build a life that did not hinge on their approval. Conversation drifted. Someone complimented Hannah's engagement photos. Someone else asked about my job. My mother, in a tone that could have been affectionate if rearranged, asked, "So are you seeing anyone?" Again. I stood there and for a second almost fell into the default script of diminishing myself with a joke. Instead, I said, "I'm actually working on a few projects that mean a lot to me." The words were simple, but they felt like reclaiming territory. Later, after the salad course, my dad made a comment about being practical and suggested real estate and settling down. People laughed. My pulse hiked, but I breathed. Then, as if on cue, My mother reached across and said, this time softer but loaded, "You're not half the woman your sister is." Silence stretched, the way it always had, but then something different happened inside me. I felt less like the thing being judged and more like a person with reasons and edges and a voice. I looked at my mother and said, "I've been listening to you for a long time. I hear what you mean. But I am not a fraction of anyone. I'm not half of Hannah. I'm whole in my own ideas, choices, mistakes, and wins." The sentence was not planned beyond the core truth. Once it left my mouth, I felt it settle differently in the room. Half is a funny word when you think about it. It implies a division made by someone else, like an appraisal assigned externally. What I said reframed it. If you're measuring me against another person, you are using a scale that belongs to you, not to me. My parents blinked. Hannah's smile held its breath. A guest coughed politely. My words didn't explode into fireworks. But they shifted the air. That night, the conversation didn't end the family dynamic. My mother still asked those questions in subtle variations later, and my father still offered backhanded advice disguised as wisdom. But something fundamental changed. I had spoken, and I had declared my own measure. The declaration was small and not spectacular, no dramatic exits, no throwing of plates, but it was decisive. After the dinner, in my car, I felt both liberated and exhausted. Liberation because I had used my voice in a room that had been used to quieting me. Exhaustion because speaking your truth in a previously hostile territory is draining. The act of becoming yourself is an art in which you must constantly repair and rebuild. In the weeks that followed, I kept pressing on. I accepted a speaking gig at a local university where I talked about storytelling and the courage to tell your own life. I began mentoring a teenager who wanted to write, and her excitement reminded me of the raw pleasure of new beginnings. I found myself saying yes to things that once would have terrified me and no to small humiliations I used to accept as the price of family peace. Then, something I didn't expect happened. My dad invited me to lunch. It was not a formal apology. He is not a man of big confessions. But over soft bread and coffee, he told me about a time when he'd felt small, when his own father had compared him unfavorably to an older cousin. He admitted, carefully, with a man's caution, that comparisons were a pattern he'd inherited. "I didn't know how to stop," he said, "and maybe I passed it on." He didn't say "I'm sorry" at first. He said something that felt almost better, "I see you trying." To be seen by the person who'd trained you to be small was close to a miracle. It wasn't absolution for years of diminishment, but it was a crack in the thing I'd learned to think of as permanent. If my father could recognize the pattern, maybe it could be interrupted. Not erased. Patterns don't vanish overnight, but redirected. At the same time, I noticed my mother's expressions changing in subtle ways. She still judged. Not every parent can unlearn that quickly, but sometimes she caught herself mid-sentence and would say something different. Once she asked me about a volunteer project I'd been doing, not in the way of "that's nice," but with an actual question about how it was going. It felt like an inch, but inches are how paths change, and Hannah, my sister who had always been the effortless star, was complicated in ways I'd never allowed myself to examine. Alone once after a family event, she told me she'd felt pressured to perform all her life too, to be the perfect daughter, the golden child, the one who would justify the family's sacrifices. She confessed to nights when she'd lie awake worrying she'd disappoint everyone. Her confession didn't negate the ways her life had been easier, but it humanized her. She wasn't a villain, she was another person carrying the weight of expectations, albeit in a different shape. Be honest, would you have had the courage to make this choice? I'll tell you what I did next. I began to intentionally create my own rites of passage. I planned a small trip with a couple of friends to celebrate a writing fellowship I received. I refused to shrink for family events. I showed up when I chose to and I left when I needed to. Saying no became a form of preservation rather than punishment. The path forward was not a single dramatic turning point but a series of micro-decisions, every one of them adding up. To speak up, to walk away, to keep trying. It was like learning a new language. The climax arrived not as a single thunderclap but as a slow, dawning confrontation one autumn afternoon. My sister and I were at home for my niece's birthday, an intimate, messy kitchen party with finger food and song. The house vibrated with the thin, joyous chaos of small children. I had promised myself I'd behave, that I wouldn't let old ghosts dictate my mood. Halfway through the party, my mother pulled me aside. Her face was taut with a strain I recognized. She was about to say something big or try to calm herself before spilling. "We need to talk," she whispered. We stepped into the quieter back of the house where the sound of laughter faded like a radio down the hall. My mother's eyes were moist, and my father stood nearby, hands in his pockets. This felt different from the dinners and the small barbs. Something in the way they spoke told me this was an attempt at repair. "We've been thinking," my father started, his voice low. Maybe we were too hard on you. On both of you, in different ways." My mother nodded and swallowed. I waited. My throat felt thick. My mother's hands trembled. "It was never our intention to hurt you," she said. "We wanted better for you both, and sometimes we thought pushing would get you there. But we see now it hurt you instead." She looked at me as if searching for clue of how much I'd been wounded. "We want to do better." There was a stunned silence. My first reaction was to hold up a wall. My second was to allow myself to be hopeful, cautious and not naive. Hope felt strange and dangerous after years of conditioning myself to expect criticism. "Okay," I said softly. "What does that look like?" What followed was a conversation unlike any we'd had, not a lecture, but a clumsy, earnest attempt at listening. They asked questions, real questions, about how my childhood felt, about specific moments when I'd felt diminished. They apologized for some things, explained others, and admitted ignorance for the rest. It wasn't perfect. They stumbled on defensiveness. They flinched when I named certain hurts that had long been minimized. But they also tried. My dad described the pressure he'd felt from his own family to produce a successful child and how that fear made him overvalue certain achievements. Hannah came up and hugged me then, not the quick social hug, but a deeper one. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted this to be a competition between us." Her words were a salve and a reminder that you can both be hurt by the same system and also be its beneficiary in different ways. Then my mother did something that surprised me. She asked if I'd consider family therapy. She admitted she didn't know how to change the pattern except with help. The asking felt monumental. It was a step toward accountability. Could a therapist unweave decades of habit? Maybe. Would my parents stick with it? There was no guarantee. But the offer was there, and for the first time I felt that an adult conversation about adult behavior might actually be possible in our home. Even within that fragile progress, not everything was resolved. During the party, a cousin, someone who'd always loved Hannah's achievements, made a remark loud enough for me to hear, "Well, some people just have it easier." That sentence landed like a small stone in water. I felt the old urge to retreat. Instead, I turned and said, calmly, "Everyone has different strengths. No one's life is a simple line." It was small. It rippled. The real confrontation came later, when I sat down with Hannah alone. We were in the backyard under a porch light, the night air cool and honest. I asked her a question I'd been carrying. "Did you ever notice how they measure me?" She was quiet for a second and then, in the voice she used when she wanted to be very real, she said, "I did. I saw how my success made things easier for you, and it made me furious at myself often. I didn't know how to change it because I thought supporting you meant not stealing your spotlight. I did the opposite." We talked like that for hours, about parents and the way they project, about the pressure of being the golden child, about the guilt that comes with it. I told her how aching it was to grow up in a house where your wins are always a comparative footnote. She told me about the nights she'd cried over not feeling enough even when everyone told her she was. We found a strange sympathy in each other, two people shaped by the same expectations but manifesting the effects differently. At the height of that night, during the kind of honest vulnerability no one plans for, my sister said, "Let's promise to be each other's witnesses, truly. If they start comparing, we stop it. If they pull back into old habits, we call it out." She offered a pact, and in that moment the old rivalry in my chest loosened. It wasn't that everything would be fixed, but we were choosing to break a cycle between us, even if the rest of the family was not ready. If you were watching this moment unfold in person, what would you be thinking? Drop your thoughts below. The following weeks were a test of whether words could become habits. Family therapy started. It was awkward at first. The therapist asked questions that hit hard, my parents flinched, and we all felt the uncomfortable stutter of learning to be honest to someone who wasn't kin. There were sessions where my parents defended themselves, sessions where they cried, and sessions where they listened without speaking. Real change, the therapist told us quietly one Thursday evening, doesn't come from a single admission but from regular, deliberate practice. At home, slip-ups happened. Mom would make a comparative remark and then apologize. Dad would compliment Hannah in a way that made me feel invisible, and Hannah would redirect the conversation to include me. These little course corrections felt like stitches. They didn't remove scars, but they began to hold things in a different shape. The climax of our confrontation came not in a shout but in a small, practical scene that felt symbolic. At a family gathering some weeks later, a holiday that used to resemble a contest, my parents did something they hadn't done in years. They asked my opinion on an important family decision. Not as a courtesy. They asked because they meant to hear what I thought. I had a voice at that table in a new way. I wasn't a second-hand advisor or an also-ran, I was a contributor. Hearing myself speak and having my words taken into account felt like an earthquake that didn't destroy the house but gently rearranged the foundation. Confrontation, I learned, doesn't always have to be a showdown. Sometimes it is a series of small, honest acts that amount to a revolution. The brasher moments, the angry texts, the slammed doors, are dramatic, yes, but real change lives quietly and bends slowly. That's what happened between us. Months passed. Life didn't flip into some tidy ending. Patterns shifted like tectonic plates, slowly and with occasional tremors. My parents continued therapy. Some of their instincts stuck, others fell away. They still loved their shorthand for pride, but they learned to pause now, to listen before they compared. The pause saved many tiny humiliations and allowed room for real conversations. Hannah and I kept our pact. When a sisterly slip of favor crossed a line, we called each other in, not out. We built rituals that weren't about public performance, monthly dinners just the two of us where no one else could critique or compare, a text thread filled with encouragement and the small victories that used to go unsaid. Those rituals didn't fix everything, but they grounded us. My life changed in quieter but meaningful ways. I pursued the fellowship I'd applied to and, shockingly, won it. The acceptance letter felt like a personal answer to every "you're not enough" that had been thrown at me. I traveled for the fellowship, met other storytellers, and found myself on stages where no one had a secret ledger on me. The work I did afterward, teaching storytelling workshops, writing long-form pieces, fed something inside me that had been starved by constant comparison. I built a career that felt like a faithful reflection of my values. Financially, things were steady, not extravagant. I moved to a new apartment with a window that lets in morning light and a small balcony where I grow basil. I started mentoring young writers and felt a deep, quiet joy when they found their voices. Love came at a slow, steady pace, dates that felt honest and respectful, and eventually someone special sat with me through a long conversation and asked about my childhood with curiosity and tenderness, not judgment. That person's presence was not a cure but a companion. The hardest, most humbling lesson I learned was that forgiveness isn't an event, it's a practice. Forgiving my parents didn't mean forgetting. It meant making space for their humanity while protecting my own boundaries. I forgave them for what they had done and for what they had failed to see. I also forgave myself for having believed their version of me for too long. There were days when the old voices returned, whispering that I was less. Those days still come, but they hold less power now because I have built a life with proof that contradicts them. I have family members who try, siblings who show up, friends who cheer loudly, and projects that demand my full attention. Comparisons still exist in the world, but they no longer determine the measure of me. Sometimes I think about that night I pushed my chair back. If I could go back, would I do it differently? I don't know. In some ways, the chair scrape was the first real sound of my life rearranging itself. It was messy, brave, and human. Walking away that night didn't immediately fix my life, but it started a process that allowed me to find a voice and to ask for better. So what is the final truth? I'm not half anything. I am not a fraction of someone else's triumphs or failures. I am whole, flawed, growing, and undeniably my own person. The family that loved me imperfectly learned to see me more. My sister and I discovered new ways to hold each other. My parents, slowly, imperfectly, learned to measure less and listen more. Do you think they did the right thing? Share your opinion in the comments, and if you want more powerful stories like this, please subscribe. Your support helps me bring more real stories to life. One last thing before I go: if you're sitting at a table where someone's words make you smaller, know this: leaving can be an act of care for yourself, and returning with boundaries can be an act of courage. You don't have to choose between family and sanity. You can, painfully and beautifully, choose both in measured ways. When you reclaim your voice, you aren't abandoning the people who hurt you. You're giving yourself permission to live with more dignity. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, you are not a fraction. You are whole.